Hi, Misha here, and this video is for the 4th of July, and I thought it would be fun to look at all the various USS Enterprises, past, present, and future, and actually all the models, but one are from Eaglemoss. So we'll kind of just talk about each, mostly from a real world point of view, like creation of the models and things like that, but also of course talking about the various classes. So with that, let's get started. And really, the starship began here with the actual USS Enterprise CV-06 from World War II. And quite ironically, this model is still from Eaglemoss. Of course, it's not from their starship collection. Rather, it's from their Warships of the World collection. Diecast, and I've done several videos now looking at these, but just in case you were not aware, yeah, they do real military ships, and vehicles for that matter, too. And even some airplanes. But yeah, the USS Enterprise CV-06 was the most decorated U.S. Navy ship of World War II, and really the only true fleet carrier to survive all of World War II. It was the second member in the three-member Yorktown class, with the USS Yorktown, not surprisingly, being the first member and her sister ship. But whereas Yorktown was lost at Midway, Enterprise would continue on. Even their younger sister Hornet had a relatively brief career, being sunk just about a year after commissioning at Guadalcanal. Enterprise was commissioned slightly before World War II, and much to her good fortune and the Japanese bad, she was at sea on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked. Therefore, she escaped damage, and while the U.S. had her traditional battleship fleet out of action, their three carriers at the time were available, and quickly Enterprise was used to launch attacks on the Japanese throughout the Pacific, giving one of the few offensive strikes. And while Hornet helped actually launch the Doolittle raid against Tokyo in April of '42, Enterprise was an escort and protection. She was then there at Midway, helping sink the four Japanese fleet carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hairyu, that day. She would be at major battles, including the Solomon Islands and the Santa Cruz Islands. She would be damaged, but would always come back into service. And actually in late 1942, before the new Essex class really were available, the Enterprise was nearly, at least as far as major fleet assets, the only thing that stood between the Japanese and the Americans in the Pacific. This was the major asset. It was even joked by the crew that it was essentially Japan versus Enterprise, and they didn't give Japan very good odds in that. She kept fighting. Finally, once relief came in 1943, she would go in for a much-needed overhaul and refit that year, and she would be back in action in '44. and towards the end of the war she was used to attack Japanese naval installations like at Truk, and by 45 she was being used as a specialized night fighter carrier. But then in May, after Okinawa, she would be hit and suffer pretty significant damage from a Japanese kamikaze. And so she was in for repairs that summer. And when Japan surrendered, she was still in. But she would get out, and her last major military action was part of Operation Magic Carpet, which helped transport over 10,000 U.S. soldiers home. And then from there, she would put into New York in January of 1946 and be decommissioned just over a year later. And many efforts were taken to turn her into a museum ship to preserve her for posterity, because she was the only surviving member of her class, really the only pre-World War II carrier to survive, at least of combat note. And again, she was the most decorated U.S. Navy ship of the war. But even though attempts were made, eventually, in 1956, they started breaking her up and scrapping her, which was completed a short time later, and thus ended her history. But then let's get into Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry and the Constitution class USS Enterprise NCC 1701. This is one of my newest models and one of the newest in the Eaglemoss collection. This is the Enterprise as she appeared in the original Cage pilot episode, 1964-65 era. I've done a full video on this, so I won't harp on too long, but I will say that Matt Jeffries showed several designs to Gene Roddenberry and the others, and this was ultimately what was selected, even though originally Jeffries didn't want to do the saucer. He was more enamored with rings and balls, but yeah. And initially, the first name considered was the USS Yorktown. Interesting for the class. But Gene Roddenberry himself said that he was a big fan of CV-06 and therefore really wanted the name Enterprise to be used. Now there was, of course, the later nuclear USS Enterprise CV-65, but it was CV-06 from World War II, a war that Roddenberry participated in, that this was named after. Now, originally, and this is the reason the Cage model has a larger deflector and a few other larger components, Roddenberry considered the crew would be about 100 to 150. Now, by the time of the first pilot, the Cage, that had been up to about 200, 205, but still yet a somewhat smaller ship than what we would end up getting. The Enterprise was launched as part of the Constitution class in the year 2245, although early on the date was not terribly well fixed. In fact, some sources had it more like 2180 or 2150. Her first captain was Robert April. Her second captain, at least full-time, was Christopher Pike. And then James R/James T. Kirk would take over in 2265. Again, the original Cage pilot had a few differences in the model. The spikes on the ends of what were known at the time as power pods or engine pods. They were not called warp nacelles yet. And the backs were a little different. And the deflector, at the time known as a communications array, which is why it looks like a satellite dish, was larger, again because it was supposed to be a smaller ship. And the idea was to have a very sleek hull and having the engine pods, the power pods, separated because they were dangerous. And then, of course, when you move to the revised style seen throughout the original series, we get the rounded, what would later be considered Bassard collectors, but back then were just the engines. And again, the communication dish is smaller. This would be the Constitution class with a crew of between 400 and 450, depending on the exact source and day of the week. And it would be having a length set at roughly 288 meters long. And would pretty much be the pride of the fleet, the long-range, exploratory, and diplomatic and defense ship. Originally known as the quote-unquote starship class, later it would be retconned as the Constitution class, and meant to be able to be sent out on at least 5-year missions before needing major resupply, refuel, or docking at a starbase or space base. USS was originally United Spaceship, later United Starship, and NCC was essentially made up, but was an amalgamation of American and Russian airplane codes. NC combined with CS. And some say it stands for Naval Construction Contract, but I don't believe this was ever official. It's also not clear, back then they thought 1701 meant the 17th starship model, the first in its class, but later that's kind of been retconned again to mean it was the 1701st ship built in the fleet. Early days. So yeah, the original Constitutions. So the one non-Eaglemoss ship model here, and I'm cheating a bit, it's not actually of the Space Shuttle Enterprise, but it was the one I had that was closest in the size scale. This is from Corgi's Showcase edition. And yeah, the Space Shuttle Enterprise was the first space shuttle. Now, it was originally a test rig, and it was originally to be named the Constitution, and that would be OV-101. But through a letter-writing campaign, fans of the show petitioned President Ford back in 1976 to rename the first space shuttle Enterprise. And while he never directly acknowledged, he did instruct NASA to change it, saying he was partial to the name Enterprise. Everyone knows the reality. Now, this was not a full flight-ready ship. It did not have real engines. It had fake engines. It did not have a real heat shield. It had mock-up. And it lacked some of the other gear. But it was used to test the shuttle design. They did ground vibration tests. They did flight tests being launched from a 747. And it did have independent glide flight down on several occasions in 1977. And while Columbia was always planned to be the first space-worthy example, they had planned after testing to retrofit Enterprise to be space-worthy, but in the end they actually used an even older static test model, 099 and made it into Challenger. It was easier to convert it than it was Enterprise. So she was left there. Now, interestingly, when Challenger had her accident in 1986, they again considered retrofitting Enterprise here into a space-worthy vehicle, but instead they ended up using leftover parts, components, spares to make Endeavour. So with that, she would hang out in the Smithsonian for a while, and then transfer to New York, where she would be part of the USS Intrepid Museum. Intrepid actually being a member of the Essex class carrier group, the ones that would succeed the Yorktown class. So real world applications there, and even though she never flew to space, she nearly did, and she was a critical part of the testing of the space shuttle program, and frankly the only space shuttle in existence in the 1970s. So I thought, why not throw her on the table with this little recantation. And speaking of the 70s, let's move into that decade. This here is a model of the Phase 2 concept Enterprise. Only a little bit seen on screen in diagrams in the films. Now, after the original series was taken off the air in 1969, it wouldn't stay off the air for very long. Yes, Star Trek was syndicated, but there was also the animated series that ran for a couple of seasons, and it was essentially the same Enterprise, except it had 2 turbo lifts in the bridge instead of 1, which makes a lot of sense, frankly. And then they started planning on kind of a revival. Originally, it was going to be a television movie, Planet of the Titans. Then there was going to be a television series known as Phase 2, which this is a concept of here. And Matt Jeffries was brought back on board as kind of a temporary consultant. And his idea was, okay, the saucer and the star drive section, the secondary hull, really shouldn't be changed, but we can change the engines, the power pods, because that was a modular component, and we could also change the sensor dish, the deflector, and a few other external components. So that's what they did. They went to more swept-back pylons for the pods. They flattened them. Now this actually, with the flat engines, was a concept that did date back to the 60s. That was a concept that Jeffries had prepared to show Roddenberry if he didn't like the circular with the straight nacelle supports, struts. The angled ones with the flat, but it never came to it. Well, now, here they are. He also recognized one of the problems with the series was there was no emitters for photon torpedoes or phasers on the studio model originally, meaning that when they fired them on screen, it was just kind of being shot from wherever. Well, now he put a phaser emitter above the sensor dish, soon to be known as the deflector. And he made a few other changes, including new panel lines and things like that. Well, a model was constructed and nearly complete for the Phase 2. The next step, in 1977, instead of a TV series, was to go to a film, which of course would ultimately result in Star Trek, the motion picture, 1979. They did consider using the Phase 2 or modifying it, but in the end they decided it just wouldn't hold up on the big screen. I mean, it had been made for a 20-inch television screen, and they wanted to put it on something exponentially larger. So they built a whole new model, but they used quite a bit of the concept from Phase 2, including the nacelles with the swept-back pylons. They used the bridge that had the 2 turbo lifts. And they used the phaser support on the gooseneck, although now it was turned into 2 photon torpedo tubes. Good deal. And instead, a newcomer, Andrew Probert, added phasers and little ball turrets on the top and the bottom of the saucer. And generally speaking, more detailing was added. They still tried to keep the hull slim and trim, sleek. They didn't want to do the Star Wars thing where everything was busy and bulbous. But they also wanted to add more things to show, for example, where deflector grid lines would be, where tractor beam emitters might be, more windows. And they did what was called Aztecing to help add scale. And of course, they went to the concave deflector, which by now is really more of a deflector than a sensor. A concept that did get tossed around during the Phase 2 program as well. And a lot of work went into the model. It was unfortunately damaged more than once during construction and after, so a lot more work went into repairing it, and a lot of work went into its paint job, which unfortunately didn't translate onto screen, which is why in the motion picture she's more of a pearlescent white, but by Wrath of Khan she's more of a matte off-white or gray, because they gave her a light coating to cut down on the glare from her paint so she could be easier to film. Yes, this is a blind guy talking about colors, so if I'm wrong, sue me. But the model received a lot of acclaim from people looking at it, and was actually pretty advanced for the late 70s, but already by the 80s it was considered not the easiest thing to film with. It was considered heavy, but nevertheless it was in Wrath of Khan, and then it was given damage that was not permanent for that film, and then a little bit of more permanent damage for The Search for Spock. And of course the original shooting model wasn't destroyed to that film, but other miniatures were. And they thought originally, after destroying the Constitution class, NCC 1701, they might go to a new model, such as the Excelsior. It's worth pointing out that after Wrath of Khan, Starfleet, justifiably so, considering her battle damage and age, was planning to just decommission the original Enterprise. Keep in mind, she was originally commissioned in 2245, had been refit around 2270, 2271, so even the refit is well over a decade old, and that plus the damage, yeah, it's probably time just to put her out to pasture. Her specs really hadn't changed much. She was a little bit longer at 300 meters because of the sweepback engines. The saucer stayed pretty much the same dimensions though, and her general role was the same, although again, it's a 40-year-old design now, so probably not the cutting edge of Starfleet tech, and not as fast as the Excelsior. However, that gets us over to the NCC 1701A. A lot different, huh? Again, they reused the same studio model for one scene in Star Trek 4, and then of course Star Trek 5 and Star Trek 6. Even though she was supposed to be a different ship, it was the same model. But after a decade, and some of the quote-unquote removable damage not being as removable as they'd hoped early on, she ended up needing a whole new paint job for Star Trek 5, and even another one for Star Trek 6. So again, color and hue can vary, even just on the shot, anything from that pearlescent white to a pretty dark gray. Otherwise, there's really no change. Obviously, the model wouldn't be because it's the same model, and even in the ships, it's still a Constitution class. Now, some secondhand sources say that she was to be the USS Yorktown before being renamed the USS Enterprise after that ship's destruction, which is a nice homage to the original name. Another couple of sources claim that she was originally to be the USS Tahoe, which I have to wonder was named after the Japanese aircraft carrier. Maybe not, but anyway. And some say that she was an older ship that was already in commissioning and just was renamed Enterprise, but I don't think that's true because in Star Trek V you hear Scotty complaining about the workmanship and the shakedown crew, so if she was already an existing ship, why would she be in that kind of condition? That voyage started off in 2287, and the last time we saw the Enterprise A was during the Undiscovered Country, which is in 2293. And at the end of that film, Uhura reports that they're ordered back to space dock for decommissioning. The thing is, earlier in the film, Kirk does a log entry saying that the ship will be the care of a new crew after their mission ends. So, since she was less than a decade old, I would think that decommissioning would be more for that crew, or that particular voyage mission, than the ship in general, because the ship was in good shape with some battle damage, but nothing bad, and she was less than a decade old, so why would they decommission her? So, maybe second line ship, because again the Constitution class is getting up on at least 50 years old as a class. But at the same time, we see a destroyed one of these, Constitution that is, at the Battle of Wolf 359. Now, of course, in reality, that was the shot up miniature from Search for Spock. But in the universe, we have to conclude that at least one Constitution class was still in service around 2366, 2367. Fun fact, Picard's Stargazer was originally going to be a Constitution class before it was changed to the new Constellation class. And the similarity of those two class names is not an accident because of dubbing and stuff. But, yeah. Well, moving on. What about the B? I'm cheating a little bit here with the model Enterprise B. I've laid these out in chronological order as they first appeared on screen. Now the B was always kind of planned to be a member of the Excelsior class. And we saw a model of the B in the Enterprise D the first couple of seasons. And it was just, well, an Excelsior, unmodified, throughout Next Generation. It wasn't until the 1994 movie Generations that they actually made the Enterprise B a modified or refit Excelsior. But all they really did, they added 2 extra engines on the back of the saucer. So those would be impulse, not warp. And they added some fins to the drive section and a couple other small things. Now some of these were just to make her look different. The fins were actually added so they could be torn away to do damage without damaging the expensive and well-used and popular Excelsior model. Ironically, as it turns out, they still ended up doing damage the way they stuck them on, but that's why they're there. So, really I should show her as an Excelsior, but yeah, we'll fudge this time. Yeah, she was meant to be an Excelsior class, which was overall the next big thing after the Constitution. We see lots of Excelsiors throughout Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and even Voyager. And we even see at least one other refit type, the Lakota, if I remember correctly, in Deep Space Nine. Bigger, faster, more powerful. These were considered super dreadnoughts or super heavy cruisers, and were pretty much the mainstay of Starfleet for a good 50 years or more. And we know that they were still building them decades later after their introduction. So, some people say the original Excelsior was a failure. That can't be true because they was produced in so many numbers. Of course, the real-world production, the Excelsior model was great for the next generation because it gave them access to a film-grade, miniature film-grade model for a TV show on a TV budget. And you have to remember, in 1987, 1988, 1989, the model wasn't that old because it was originally made for the 1984 film Search for Spock. Of course, there and again, the refit Enterprise B version was for the 1994 film, and it was captained by John Harriman, and we don't really know much about it, aside from he had a Sulu at the helm, and on his first mission, he potentially killed Captain Kirk. Well, with that, let's move on to the next generation. Hope everyone has had and is having a good holiday. Appreciate you spending some time with me. I thought this would be a good time to do the big Enterprise overview because Eaglemoss is pretty well at the end of their collection, but they have a few more to put out. With the COVID thing, who knows when they'll come out, and we're good. And so, yeah, let's move on to the 24th century. The Enterprise D, probably the one that honestly has the most screen time, and in some ways is more famous than even the original Constitution class, maybe? Hard to say, but Next Generation had 4 films, 7 seasons, series. Compare that with the 6 films and 3 live action and 2 animated seasons of the original series. Maybe. And whereas the original Enterprise, Matt Jeffries had to develop it from scratch and showed Gene Roddenberry multiple designs, and it took a while. I mean, to be expected. It was something totally new. Andrew Probert, who had worked on the motion picture, was really instrumental in the D being what it is. In fact, this design predates the concept of TNG. Going back to 1979, 1980, originally Probert wanted to do a whole new Enterprise, but since it was to be a refit of the existing Constitution, there was only so much anyone could do and keep the refit plausible. Even as it was, it's not really that plausible in some aspects to be a refit. You kind of get the ship of Theseus or thing. But anyway, the original concept for the D was what Probert would have done if he could have done it. And it seems like one of the big sticking points for him, he didn't like that the nacelles, the engines, were over the saucer. He thought they would be better below, which from a safety standpoint, okay, maybe, but there's no gravity in space. But anyway, for whatever reason, he thought that. He also wanted something less strung out. The original Enterprise has 3 long, thin connections, pylons, the gooseneck and the 2 for the nacelles. Something more, compacted in. And so the original concept was kept in the back of his mind, and when he started working on what would become the Next Generation around 1986, kind kind of in a very good backdoor self-advertising, he let some of the powers that be kind of accidentally see his sketches, and they're very quickly approved. And so really the D was the D from the beginning. A few changes were made here and there to coloration and a little bit to the nacelle pylons, but not a whole lot. And this was to be a much larger vessel than the original Enterprise. The original, like I said, had been 288 meters, roughly. The film model was more like 300. This was to be originally 600 meters. But then through a little bit of last-minute changing, it grew to over 640 meters. It was originally conceived to have a crew of 3,500. But in the interest of production, this was decreased to around 1,200, then 1,100, and then finally was set at just over 1,000, with all the extra space on the 42 decks said to be there for transporting of goods or personnel or to install future installations. Basically, the idea was, if not to make a true generational ship, to make a ship that could be adapted for the future. And actually, in the episode we'll talk about in a minute with Enterprise C, yesterday's Enterprise, they mentioned in that the Galaxy class could carry 6,000 troops. So that's pretty good. And I don't know if that's total or in addition to the 1,000 crew. Another thing that was kind of key to this design from the get-go was the saucer separation. Now, this concept had been flirted with on and off since the Constitution class, and a couple of features on the Constitution class's saucer were even retroactively said to be landing gear, although when they were originally put on the hull, they weren't. That's just something that people add for continuity. And in fact, in the excellent Star Trek Continues fan production, in its last episode, they actually show the Constitution separating. So anyway, that was meant for the Enterprise D, which initially was going to be the Enterprise G, but they backed it up a little bit, because originally they were going to do it 100 years in the future. They backed that up to about 80 in reality. Makes sense. You know, and they went to a new phaser system, which I think is neat. The strip phasers versus the ball phasers. It's logical, very futuristic. They went to a very curvy, angular design, very few straight edges. They went to this ovular saucer. They went to more compact nacelles. By this point, the deflector dish is a true deflector dish, doing deflector dish things. We have a total of 3 shuttle bays, and many have considered it to be a Hilton in space because of its softer interior with carpeting and padding, and of course the idea that it has families on board, which on the one hand makes sense, on the other hand is completely ludicrous. That's a story for another video. But yeah, they originally would make 2 models. The original Constitution class in the series was an 11-foot model. Interestingly, the film one, even though it had more detail, was slightly smaller at 8 foot. Well, for the Enterprise D, they originally commissioned 2 models, a 2-footer with limited lighting for long shots, more action-oriented shots, and a very large, very heavy 6-footer that was fully lit, but was much harder to shoot with. And the 6-footer, the physical model, could separate, which was pretty neat. But in Season 3, they got a new one, an intermediate model, a 4-footer. And it can't be a coincidence that after Season 3, we really don't see saucer separation much, because the 6-foot model was pretty well retired after Best of Both Worlds. That is, at least until the movie Generations, when it was brought back and dusted off one more time, because again, we needed a saucer separation. And the 2-footer, too, was retired. Again, they pretty much retired 2 models and replaced them with the 4-footer that did things. And, of course, they used a lot of stock photographs and stock video imaging that was filmed early in Season 1 by ILM. But yeah, the model stuff is neat, and the Galaxy class was supposed to be a big grand ship, but only supposed to be about 6 members of the class. And we see the Enterprise, of course. We can assume there was a USS Galaxy. In Season 2, we first see a facsimile of the USS Yamato. And then later in the season, we see the actual USS Yamato right before she blows up. And this is confirmed that it was named in honor of the Japanese battleship, the flagship, at least before the Musashi in World War II, which I do have an Eaglemoss model of as well that I should have brought out, but that would have been a funny joke. Her sister ship Yamato. Imagine it in your heads. But, yeah. We also see the USS, Odyssey in Deep Space Nine. Challenger. And we see the USS Challenger in Voyager. And we see the USS Venture. So yeah, I think that's the only ones we see. There might be 1 or 2 more, but yeah, that's the 6 named ones I can think of. And considering how big and convoluted these were, it makes sense. And as the Next Generation kind of proved, it was a bit of a glass cannon, because these things like to have a warp containment failure at the drop of a cat. I'm pretty sure there was a whole episode where Spot the Cat peed on it in the wrong place and shorted out the system, and yeah, they nearly blew the ship up. I'm not even really kidding, because, yeah. But yeah, the Enterprise D. But we skipped the C. One nice thing about jumping from the A to the D, it gave them the B and the C to play with for narrative purposes. And again, Andrew Probert had kind of sketched out and even done a full painting of a concept of the C. Here we have it here. This is one of the bonus or specials from Eaglemoss. This is of the original Probert concept C. And he very actively was trying to make it look like a love child of a Galaxy class and an Excelsior. And I think it's a neat looking model. I was really interested when they announced this one and ordered it. I like the lines of it. I really do. It has a sleeker, faster look than the D. In some ways, to me, it almost looks more advanced than the D, though. Well, in Season 3, we had the episode with the return of Tasha Yar, yesterday's Enterprise, and it was earlier than they expected to ever need the C. And they had this concept. What they didn't have was time. Much like the D, this concept C has lots of curvy lines. It has a kind of ovular saucer. Very nice, but it would have taken them a long time to develop and build a model. So since they were a TV show, they had to kind of make something more simplified. And that's where we get the actual USS Enterprise, NCC 1701C, Ambassador class. Da-da-da-da. It does take inspiration from the Probert concept. But honestly, more than being in between an Excelsior and a Galaxy, this seems more of an in-between a Constitution refit and a Galaxy. Could be wrong, but I say that because it has a very round saucer. Much like the Galaxy, the secondary hull, engineering hull, is smaller. It intentionally has kind of oversized nacelles, but they are more flattened, like a Galaxy. We have kind of partial phaser strips, not the full nearly 360, but they're not the old school balls either. And a very refit feature is the deflector dish. It has a little bit of next generation going on because it's a little angled, but it's very refit style. But they had to make this in a hurry, and they had to make it on a television budget. So honestly, I think considering those constraints, it's always been one of my favorite ships. I got a model of this back in the 90s, and I just thought it was a neat design. I like the huge saucer. In a lot of ways, if it was just a little bit more refined, I'd probably like it more than the D. That's a little bit heresy, but there you go. We don't know exactly when the Ambassador and the Seas came into service. We know, for example, the Enterprise D was first commissioned in 2363, and the series begins in 2364, so right after her shakedown cruise. Beta canon kind of intimates that the Enterprise C was launched in 2332, captained by Rachel Garrett, who was still in command when she went into battle with Romulan warbirds in 2344, defending a Klingon colony, and was presumed destroyed, and in reality was, with the resetting of the timeline. So we don't know when the B was retired. We don't know a lot about the C, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But, yeah. I think it's neat. And we don't see the Ambassador a lot. We do see a few other ambassadors in Next Generation, and we hear a reference to the Ambassador class, USS Hannibal, in Deep Space Nine, but yeah, it doesn't seem nearly as popular as the Excelsior, but that's okay. It's not overused. Neat models. Really like them. And moving right along, we have the so-called Future Enterprise D, or the anti-time. Oh, good grief. Let me... See, these stands are great. That's why I keep my hands on them. Let me set this back in here, maybe add a little tack, and I'll be right back. Sorry about that, folks. These stands, the clear plastic part, actually supports the D models quite well. They go over the saucer and around the engineering hole in the bottom. But sometimes on these bases, they don't plug in as tight as you'd want. And this is a heavy model, so I think it was pulling it down. Sometimes I use a little bit of blue tack just to slot it in there. I mean, you could always glue it, but no harm, no foul. Yeah, the Future Enterprise D, as seen pretty much exclusively in All Good Things, the two-parter, the full-length final part of Next Generation. Gotta be honest, at first, I really didn't care for this design. I remember there was the Playmates model back in the 90s, and it's obviously they took the Galaxy and they just stuck bits on to try to update it and make it different. But it has grown on me a bit, and at least they stuck a lot on. We've got the phaser cannon on the underside. We've got these two, what I always assumed were additional smaller phaser cannons here. They could be sensor arrays. We've got this device structure behind the bridge. They've added extra phasers on the back of the 2 original nacelles. Internally, it now has a cloaking device because in this future the Romulan Empire is no more, so treaty doesn't matter. And of course the big thing is the 3rd nacelle, sometimes referred to as a dreadnought in the Star Trek universe. It also has these little fins below the warp nacelles. And of course they had to move the impulse to the back here because of the new engine. Yep. So a lot of little things. We don't know exactly when the future is this takes place in, but it's between 2395 and probably 2405. So, nearly at the time of Picard. And in this future, obviously, the Enterprise wasn't destroyed. This was Admiral Racker's flagship, and it's a beast. It's a warship. We see it, if not, well, we see it basically one-shot a Klingon ship and take on others. And she's faster, and they seem like they finally kind of fixed the warp field collapsing at the piss of a cat feature. But yeah, this was done for the last episode. And much like with other models like the B, all the changes were done that they could be removed to return the model to its original state. And these are done for the 4-foot model. Interestingly, the model didn't see a lot of use after this. Of course, there was the Odyssey at the end of Season 2. And then we have the USS Venture at the beginning of Season 4 of Deep Space Nine, which has pretty much everything returned to normal, except for whatever reason the Venture still has the added phasers on top of the nacelles. So this is often sometimes kind of been called the Dominion War refit or what have you version. But yeah, of course the events of Generations meant that this actually never came to be, but I just didn't think it was honest not to have it in the lineup since it was pretty dominant in a major episode. This was originally a bonus, a free gift from Eaglemoss. And then I think more recently they've also released it as a bonus edition you can purchase on the website. But it's not on the standard catalog. And it is, like I said, quite big and quite heavy. At least for its size. Well, what about the newest ones, the newest members? I remember that in the original tech manual from before the end of Next Generation, they talked about the next Enterprise, NCC-1701E, would be a Nova class. And now, of course, it's not the Nova you're thinking of, but the name was reused. There's also a few people thinking the next one would still be a Galaxy. But in the end, after 7 seasons in a film, it was felt that a whole new model, whole new design would be good. And it kind of matched up with newer ships like the Voyager and even Defiant to some extent. The E would be the new Sovereign class, seen in 3 films: First Contact, Insurrection, and Nemesis. This is actually a longer ship, at about 685 meters compared to the 645 of the Galaxy. but she's thinner, and she has only 24 or 26 decks, depending, on that. And she has a smaller crew of around 700 to 800, so still a big ship. She was powerful, built more for combat, and the real model was built more to be just looking good on big screens, basically. Now, they did build a physical model for First Contact, but for Insurrection and Nemesis, a digital was used, and when that happened, they would integrate several small changes, including to the deflector and some of the weapons arrays and what have you. And we really don't see any other sovereigns throughout the show. You would think you would see them in Deep Space Nine during the Dominion War battle, but I think they wanted to keep this kind of special and exclusive, being the Enterprise E for the films. We can obviously assume there's at least a USS Sovereign, but yeah. It's definitely more of a return to the big, long nacelle, the more stretched out pylons, like the motion picture, although there is no real gooseneck between the two hulls, so in that sense it's more compacted. This is a design that started off in 1995 and of course was in the 1996 film, and kind of introduced a whole new generation of Starfleet ships. Of course, after that, the next Enterprise we see on screen in 2001 would actually be from their past. The NX-01 Enterprise from 2150, launched in 2151. So now we're going in the opposite direction. To do the NX class justice, I should just do a video one day on its development. It started off with John Eves, who designed the Sovereign, and he did his best, but really didn't get anywhere. So it was kind of moved over to Doug Drexler, and he too slaved over it. In all, it took over a year to come up with the design. They were trying to make something that looked at least 100 years more futuristic than the 21st century, yet at the same time looked 100 years more primitive than the original Constitution class Enterprise. And considering that design was from the 1960s, that's not exactly easy to do. Also, they wanted to do something that was familiar, but that looked different from previous iterations. And you've already seen how many Enterprises we've had, not to mention other starships. By 1999, 2000, it's almost like everything that could have been done with a saucer and two nacelles, or even 3 or 4, has been done. There was efforts to do more of a ball-shaped habitation facility, like a Daedalus class, but honestly, I can understand how that wouldn't make a great hero ship, frankly. Neat secondary ship and calendar ship, but maybe not the best hero ship. Kind of running out of time, the producers actually just wanted them to use the Akira class as it was seen in First Contact. Thankfully, there was pushback from the designers on this, but at least they gave them a bit of a direction. And I've done a video in the past. I don't really think this looks like a copy of the Akira. Is it similar? Yes, but how many other designs from anywhere are similar? I think there are enough differences that it is it's its own thing. You can say that the later Akira and the timeline takes inspiration from the old ship like this, but yeah, I think they did what they could. They also went with a new kind of hull plan, more of a metallic look that was not seen before. There's no secondary hull, therefore there's no saucer separation. The deflector's in the front. It has these booms. There was also an early push kind of from the Lockheed to P-38 Lightning. It's really an interesting story. I think a lot of people just think they just half-assed it and just lazily made it, but really nothing could be further from the truth. But when you're doing a prequel sci-fi series, you're really tying not just one arm behind your back, but one arm and half of the other. It's not an easy concept, and frankly, I think the idea of a prequel is silly. But with that out of the way, I actually liked Enterprise, and I liked the design. I think they did as good as they could, and still kind of fitted into the lineage where there was actually not any room for it. But this was also made as a CGI model only, not a physical. And, yeah. Supposedly was Earth's first Warp 5, first deep space exploration. She had a crew of roughly 80, and then she got some Makos on board. I don't think they ever say how many Makos, but, it had to have been at least a few to make it worthwhile, so she could obviously support a crew of at least 100. And really, overall, the saucer is about the size of the Constitution class, but of course it has much more inside of it, more engineering, more deflector stuff, without a secondary hull. But yeah, I'll do a video on her development one day. Next up, from Enterprise 2, we have the USS Enterprise NCC 1701J. Now, in the show, this was Season 3, a time travel episode with Daniels. All we ever really see of the J is a computer display that's not even fully visible from the top. We don't actually ever see the ship proper, the ship itself. And that was pretty much it. Even the class wasn't known. It's been sometimes called the Monarch or the Universe class. It seems like in more recent times there's been more attention given to this ship. But back then it was just nearly a throwaway. And really what they've done here, they've basically just futurized the NX class, making it look like a direct ancestor. In reality, it's supposed to be very, very huge, but it still has no secondary hull, very thin pylons. Yeah, I just brought it out. I mean, I know some people like it. I'm kind of neutral towards it. It's fine. But it was really just a throwaway episode in Season 3. But Eaglemoss has done this model, and they're doing a big version too that I probably won't pick up. Having the small one is fine. It is meant to look very much like the NX, and thus trying to give it more of a place in the universe. And that gets us to our final Enterprise. The NCC 1701F. This one sits on its stand pretty lightly, so I'll just go ahead and take it off. Now, is this a canon ship? That's hard to say. It's seen in Star Trek Online, and it's in some comics and books. It's even said that the USS Verity was an Odyssey class by some. But yeah, just thought I'd bring it out to complete the lineup. It is, again, huge, with a crew of over 1,600. It's supposedly a return to more of an exploration after the Sovereign was more combat-oriented. Supposedly has transwarp drive and a small auxiliary craft for reconnaissance and what have you back here. Whereas the J was in the standard line from Eaglemoss. The Odyssey here, the Enterprise F, is in their special bonus editions, and they do two versions, two different paint jobs. One more traditional Starfleet and one in Star Trek Online livery. And this class was supposedly commissioned around 2409, with the Enterprise F coming out a short time later. I just thought I'd mention it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because, again, it's not even really hardcore canon. But why not have it in the lineup? And speaking of that, there you go. Over 50 years of Enterprises. No, I didn't mention the Enterprise from Discovery because it's not Prime timeline. And no, I did not mention the JJ Enterprises because much the same. And I really thought about bringing out the ring ship, but it's in a different scale. It's the special size. So, Same goes with the concept NX refit, which I actually really like the NX refit, but this video was long enough, as you'll admit, so I tried to keep it to the main ones, just throwing in the F at the end for fun. And the concept C, why not? But I thought this would be a good video for the holiday, since it combines a model from history, it combines a model of the real-world space shuttle, and I do talk about those aspects a lot on this channel, and of course it combines the Star Trek, which I've not done a lot of Star Trek models or any Star Trek stuff recently, so this kind of gives me some more sci-fi hours again. Just hasn't had a lot to talk about, frankly. Well, with that, I think I'll call it a night. Hope you have a good weekend, and hope you enjoyed the video. Any questions, please post them, and as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.